What was the Windrush Scandal? To comprehend this, it's important to have a basic understanding of the history. Windrush was the name of the ship which in 1948 brought migrants from the Caribbean to Britain. Post-World War II, Britain needed people to help fill the labour gap left by a shortage of workers. And so the call went out to the colonies and former colonies, inviting those from the Caribbean, amongst others, to find employment in the UK. A law was passed which gave people from the Commonwealth who arrived before the 1st of January 1973 the right to indefinite leave to remain, but the Home Office did not issue documentation in order to reflect this status. The lack of paperwork would later leave thousands of Caribbeans vulnerable and at risk. In 2014, reports began to emerge of British citizens being wrongly detained, deported or threatened with deportation. This arose because they could not prove their legal right to stay in the UK. This led to thousands of black people and people of colour from the Caribbean being pursued by immigration officials. Many were arrested by the police, brought in for questioning and held in prisons. Others lost jobs, had schooling for their children disrupted, were unable to access hospital care or to get any form of assistance from the state, all because they were suddenly being told that their status was under question and that they were effectively illegal immigrants. A number of them were deported to the Caribbean, despite living in the UK for decades, with many having arrived in the UK as children. Even some who had been born in the UK, children of the Windrush generation, now found that they too were being threatened with deportation. In some cases, people were deported to countries they hadn't visited for years and where they had no families or support. But what had changed? In 2010, Theresa May was the Home Secretary. She was in charge of the Home Office, which has responsibility for immigration. In her role, she created what would become known as the Hostile Environment Policy. The measures were designed to make staying in the United Kingdom as difficult as possible for people without leave to remain. The hope was that they would voluntarily leave the UK. The policy was first announced by the Home Office in 2012 under the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition. The policy of reducing immigration had been one of the election pledges that the Conservative Party had made during their election campaign in 2010. The policy was widely seen as being one of the hardest-hitting immigration policies in the history of the UK and was widely criticised at the time of launch. The United Nations Human Rights Council stated that the policy fostered xenophobia within the UK, while the Equality and Human Rights Commission has found that the policy broke equalities law. Theresa May said at the time that the aim is to create here in Britain a really hostile environment for illegal immigrants. The Windrush scandal saw hundreds of Caribbean immigrants living and working in the UK wrongly targeted by immigration enforcement as a result of the government's hostile environment policies. Some of the most notable cases included a man who had worked and paid taxes for more than 30 years who was charged £54,000 for cancer treatment, and a woman who had been living in Britain for 5 decades and was thrown into a detention centre. In another case, a man who arrived in Britain from Barbados in 1961 years later lost his job as a special needs teaching assistant after his employers ruled that he was an illegal immigrant. How many people were affected by this? Of around 550,000 people from the Caribbean who migrated to the UK between 1948 and 1973, roughly 50,000 who were still in the UK may not have regularised their residency status. What was the fallout after the scandal was discovered? The then Home Secretary Amber Rudd resigned as the scandal unfolded. She had claimed the Home Office had no deportation targets. But less than 24 hours later, Rudd admitted that some immigration officers did use targets for the number of people they should deport. A Home Office unit looked at 11,800 cases of Caribbean Commonwealth nationals who were removed or detained by the department since 2002. In its initial response to the Windrush scandal, the government said there was no evidence any individuals had been deported. It later revised the figure up to 63 cases, but the records of 83 deportees contained evidence they were in the UK before 1 January 1973. This was the date when the 1973 Immigration Act, granting them British citizenship, came into force. The Home Office has since changed the way it calculates the totals, meaning people deported after being convicted of a crime are no longer counted. This despite still being British citizens due to their Windrush status. A new category was also created. Citizens were removed because they appeared to have left the UK to reside overseas for more than 2 years. This was now used to justify those people losing their entitlement to indefinite leave to remain. As a result of this, the names of 74 of the 83 deportees were removed from the list of those found to have been illegally deported. In 18 of the cases, records suggested they were detained or deported specifically because they could not demonstrate continuous residence in the UK. The government has been accused of dragging its feet over a compensation scheme for the Windrush generation. The Independent newspaper reported that the Home Office was gagging Windrush citizens with non-disclosure agreements in return for promises of fast-track compensation. But as the award-winning reporter Amelia Gentleman stated, the origins of the Windrush scandal can be traced back to 30 years of racist immigration legislation. Legislation that was designed to reduce the UK's non-white population, as was outlined in a leaked government report. A Home Office historian wrote, "The British Empire depended on racist ideology in order to function, which in turn produced legislation aimed at keeping racial and ethnic groups apart. From the beginning, concern about Commonwealth immigration was about skin colour." In the 1950s, British officials shared a basic assumption that coloured immigrants, as they were referred to, were not good for British society. As Amelia Gentleman concluded, the politics of Britain's borders, which have been administered for more than a century by the Home Office, are now inextricably connected with race and with Britain's colonial history.